everyone, or good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good night, depends on where you are in the world. Welcome to this important Smart Semiotics webinar, which is going to host Professor Lia Yoka from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. My name is Federico Belentani. I am a postdoc researcher and project manager at University of Turin, and I'm going to moderate the table that is going to discuss the content of Lia Yoka. First of all, let me say thanks to all the semiotic hotspot of Smart Semiotics, Professor Paul Buissac, and Zbigniew Roguszka, and all the team that is make this possible. So thank you very much for this opportunity. But let's not waste any other time. I'm going to introduce you Professor Lia Yoka to his paper, her paper. Professor Lia Yoka is indeed associate professor in art history and theory at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. As you know, another hotspot of semiotics in Greece with a vibrant community studying semiotics. She coordinates a cultural theories module at the Inter-University Postgraduate Program in Museology in the same university and at the University of Western Macedonia. Her background is in history, and that she researched on the same university as well as LMU Munich and in Norwich. She has several research interests around the discipline of history, of course, like semiotic of history, semiotic of art, visual semiotics. And she recently also looked at urban study as well as some topic regarding the digital, like big data visualization. So today she's going to present a paper titled Orientalist Painting, Rigid Metaphor, Flexible Meanings. And she's going to ask the important question, is the discussion on the iconography of Orientalism still relevant the way it was 15 years ago? And can we speak of a neo-Orientalism? Why and how? So, Professor Lia Yoka, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Federico Belentani, for accepting not only to be a discussant, but also to moderate this webinar. Thank you so much, Professor Bosak, for inviting me. Thank you, Zbigniew Roguszka, for the technical help, because it's really valuable. And thank you so much, Sherry Milner, Aspasia Papadima, Sotirios Bachtedis, for accepting this, accepting to read my belated paper and think about it a little bit. I will immediately begin screen sharing. The title is actually simply Neo-Orientalism, an exercise in cultural semiotics. I simplified a little bit, so I'm not going to answer the questions that Federico just read out. I'm just going to talk about two major developments in global cultural affairs over the last 40 or so years that have both been called Neo-Orientalism. Both can be discussed through the lens of Edward Said's definitions of Orientalism. And this paper asks whether the two are related to each other and how they are related to each other. In post-Cold War ideological polarizations, the cultural divides repeat older patterns of north-south and east-west divides. And while they might be challenged by social justice movements, they're officially returning and with a vengeance. The iconographies of the backward peoples of the Middle East and North Africa of 19th century ethnography are giving way to the depictions of desperately poor victims or savagely martyrical Arabs and Africans, migrants and refugees, inhabitants of camps. The sociologist Ahmed Sadi has spoken of a new Orientalism pervading these divides in the 21st century. At least since the 1990s, if not from the beginning of the 21st century. While Said claimed that scholarship of the Orient was historically fabricated and manipulated to portray the East as an inferior and foreign counterpart to the West, implicitly justifying like European colonial domination over the Arab Islamic world, Sadi describes a set of ideas with the same basic premises of Said's Orientalism, but differing in their combination, as he says, of neo-Orientalist knowledge and automated systems of surveillance. While traditional colonialism gave birth to the racist sciences of eugenics and racial hygiene, as well as to linguistic, historical, geographical, literary scholarship that was nationalist in its political priorities, neo-Orientalist bodies of knowledge that inform neo-Orientalist practices are shaped through different semantic and representational processes. Sadi offers two examples of this neo-Orientalist current. The first is research on social media that has been substituted to some extent for the field research in the colonies that anthropologists and linguists conducted in the heyday of colonialism. So instead of the old ethnography and linguistics and learning foreign languages, studying the people, today we have a kind of social media analysis. He says characteristically, Muslim environments in largely Muslim countries, as well as neighborhoods in Western geographies, become the objects of data collection, storage, and analysis by satellites, cameras, servers, and algorithms. This work of surveillance and interpretation, he adds, is conducted by analysts who are themselves Orientalists. That is, they invest their methods of collecting information, as well as the content of that information, and of course their interpretation, with the stereotypes described by Said, and of course the whole tradition of post-colonial and anti-colonial literature that has derived from Said. The Orient is culturally backward and inert, lives in a bad kind of eternity, Said's famous expression. Orientals are unable to act rationally in relationships, in creative tasks, in business. They're extremely sensual and prone to criminality. The object of this neo-Orientalist surveillance is not the individual terrorist, but patterns of life, which are suggestive of hostile intent, like weddings or prayers or gatherings of more than 3 people. The aim of this Orientalism is to control not only the present, but also the future of such environments. Sadi's second example is a preemptive security philosophy whereby terrorists or other sources of threat ought to be identified and neutralized before threatening societies and their interests. This philosophy that inspires the 21st century methods of governance has been called securitization, which is a term borrowed from finance, like the securitization of assets, and has been broadly discussed by the Copenhagen School of Surveillance Studies, as well as by many legal scholars, and most notably by movements of solidarity to migrants. For Sadi, this preemptive securitization it is exemplified by the remote extermination mechanism of the drone, directed against those who are in need of increased surveillance worldwide. Surveillance neo-Orientalism, as described by Sadi and others, is a political trend and a method of governance that has grown over the last 35 or 40 years. During the same period, though, there has been an important development in the art market. It combines 2 phenomena. On the one hand, new museums and older cultural institutions in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf states of Qatar and the Emirates, are increasingly collecting 19th century Orientalist artworks, especially paintings. Key moments have been the dissolution and auctioning of the big Saudi collection in 1999, the establishment of Sotheby's filial auction house in Istanbul 10 years later, the first auction of Islamic contemporary and Orientalist art in Qatar in the same year, and then a year later, the establishment of a big Orientalist museum in Qatar. And in 2011, amid the Arab Spring, there was an international art exhibition in Beirut, which featured a first a scholarly reappreciation of Orientalist art. And then the Louvre Abu Dhabi was established. The agreement had been signed already in 2007 with the Louvre in France, which has been described as the most visited museum in the Arab world. It has 8,000 square meters of galleries, and that makes it the largest museum in the Arab Peninsula. And it's also the most visited museum in the Arab Peninsula. Then in 2024, after a series, maybe just under 100 galleries have opened in the Gulf states. In 2024, the Bassam Freiha Art Foundation in Abu Dhabi was established in a very stylish building we'll show later. Sorry. On the other, the second manifestation of this current, collectors from Egypt, Turkey, and the Middle East, as well as curators and art historians in Europe, have engaged in hundreds of collaborations with each other, renewing the general interest in Orientalist art, made possible through a careful resignification process. It has been estimated that between the 1989 Europa und der Orient exhibition at the Martin Gropiusbau in Berlin, which thematized certain historical links between geopolitics and the visual arts, and the 2011 exhibition de Delacroix à Kandinsky, first in Brussels and in Europe, no less than 45 major exhibitions of Orientalist art were staged in the EU and Switzerland. These exhibitions, with their spatial structuring, selection, showcasing of works, as well as through the more extensive exposés and the accompanying catalogues, despite their profound differences in scope and material, agree that this art is used as a meeting point between East and West. So it's serving a culturally unifying role. A quick Google AI search that draws from the jargon of the related literature, I just asked it, Orientalist art in Orientalist exhibitions in the last 30 years, would suggest that all these exhibitions in Europe and the Middle East aim to present, I quote, Orientalist art of the 19th century in a way that acknowledges their historical context, but also challenges Western-centric interpretations by highlighting local perspectives and contemporary cultural connections. Now, what is the problem with this description? For this idea that formerly colonialist, patriarchal, or at least parochial, as it had been called, artistic production, to suddenly appear in an established platitude as proof of cultural connections, some adjustments had to be made. Collections started to exhibit less nude odalisques, less bare-breasted black slaves, no slave markets, and very few gangs of tribal Arab fighters on their horses. Writing of a large-scale traveling Tate exhibition in 2009, like the first in this trend of resignification, the official website noted how the exhibition developed organically as it migrated from London to the United States, then to Istanbul, and then Sharjah, how it shed and gained paintings, traveling from the most cosmopolitan city of the Muslim world, Istanbul, to a provincial backwater struggling to establish its name on the art map. A Saudi curator who participated in this Tate exhibition explained why local considerations in Sharjah were important in the United Arab Emirates. In our museum, we have a special policy. We have the culture thing, the religious thing. We have to be careful because our museum is for everybody, for the entire family. Now, in the next decade, the 2010s, the reappraisal and breaking auction records were largely Middle Eastern affairs, not traveling. The subjects of Orientalism were now its self-confessed apostles, as demonstrated by the royal families and private collectors from the Emirates, Qatar, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, who contributed important works to the first Tate Show, the traveling Tate Show. Ample support for this new sense that Orientalist art is a mark of interaction and exchange rather than an artistic inscription of asymmetrical power relations is found in both scholarly as well as more journalistic and commercial texts. One scholar examines these works and speaks of their potential to reconfigure and expand the definition of Orientalism. She investigates how the migration of Orientalist artworks produced in Europe to the spaces they allegedly represent may generate new art historical narratives that challenge the canonic Saidian post-colonial discourse. But that discourse was supposed to have challenged the canon in the first place. So this is a really strange reversal of what actually happened. The main impetus in this and several similar articles and books seems to be the idea of the renegotiation of stereotypes through an emphasis on other things, like the notion of taste, like if we like it, it's okay, or on Oriental, that is local, more objectively informed and less prejudiced Orientalists, as well as on the framework of the notion of nostalgia as the driving force behind the increasing acquisitions of European Orientalist art by Middle Eastern collectors. Also, scholars from the most traditional institution for 19th century art, maybe after the Musée d'Orsay, the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, compiled a collection of articles with the title Challenging Orientalism, New Perspectives in Perception and Reception, and the editors, recognizing the complicated and often contradictory position that Orientalist art occupies in the 21st century state, it is timely to interrogate anew the interpretation of Orientalist art. And their volume does so by expanding, the same expression again, the traditional borders of the field with a variety of materials, geographies, and contexts. Other texts that accompany exhibitions and collection catalogs are even more dismissive of this imagined ideological dominance of the paradigm of Edward Said and his followers, as it has been called. Kholoud Al-Fahad, presenting what he calls new Orientalism from the Middle East in the Qatar museums in Doha, celebrates a new vision. He makes specific reference to Said this time. The question for our museums is how to present these works for a local international audience in a manner that acknowledges interest in Said's concept of Orientalism, but challenges the confrontational idea of West versus East and the ethnocentric prejudice that this implies. There are several similar examples. I couldn't find a non-licensed, a non-copyright image of the Bassam Breha Foundation. Just wanted to show how different the aesthetics of the architecture is with the aesthetics of the works that are being displayed in there. So it's the kind of new dialectics in the Middle East, hyper-modernism on the one hand, and like this traditional anchoring on the other. By treating Saidian discourse as canonical, which it might have been only in a specific political, mostly academic field of reference, it's quite easy to pretend to be challenging the critique of stereotyping, homogenizing, and presenting as inferior the tradition, culture, practices, and people of the Middle East, whatever that is, or whatever the East is, the Orient is. A number of texts then present as dominant and threatening, in this case, threatening the objectivity of the scholarship on gender and race, a critical trend that has a certain currency and far-reaching political consequences. A comparable process was followed in the critique of wokeness and the woke. This construction of a threat that's not an actual threat, so that the easy defense against it appears more difficult and worthwhile than it actually is, in order to forward one's own political cause, is a classical technique of right-wing populism, as Laclau has shown already in 25. Not only of right-wing populism, but of populism in general as a genre, as Wenzel and Baronecker have shown in their research. Framing Orientalist painting as cultural connections and exchange is a direct result of forgetting what these cultural connections actually were and why they were criticized in the first place. In the case of 19th Orientalist painting, not by Said specifically, but by a series of important art historians, from Todd Porterfield in the famous The Allure of Empire, and Lyndon Nochlin in the classic The Imaginary Orient and in The Politics of Vision, and also by contemporary researchers like Syed Mohammad Marandi and NCA Shabinarad. That is a problem that has been fully swallowed and incorporated in the AI results that I read out before. Of course, there have also been parallel trends in art history that have indeed deepened our understanding of Orientalist art, even though they partially challenge Said's doctrine, comparing Anger, Delacroix, Gérôme to the German, Austrian, Italian Orientalists, as well as to painters from Nordic countries, from Russia, or from the Ottoman Empire itself. They observe in the latter a far more respectful, a far more discerning approach towards the Oriental others. Said himself had to respond to criticisms that he'd not taken these exceptional Orientalisms into account, like studies of Middle Eastern and North African peoples and places that were not necessarily inspired by the imperial gaze, but by genuine curiosity. And in the case of painters such as Etienne Dinet, more about him later, by a true admiration of the other, in Dinet's case, of Islam and of the Moroccan spirit. Other alternatives to colonial stereotypes have been also discussed in relation to women Orientalist painters in feminist literature. In the 19th century, women like painters like Henrietta Brown and Elizabeth Bauman had physical access to the harems and avoided imaginary or pornographic depictions of Turkish or Egyptian women, preferring instead to depict them fully clothed, interacting with each other, and possessing initiative, sociability, and organizational skills. This is a very famous painting by Henrietta Brown, the one below, which really, unlike most of the thousands of harem paintings between 1840 and 1920. Now, I will go to the initial question. How do these two neo-Orientalist currents, how can they be examined together? What links them? Is there a relationship between the two? There is an institutional continuity that has allowed for this revival of Orientalist painting that is critical of critique. Museums and collections have the means and the motives to grow and evolve, but this is not the case. Here, there's a shift in the economy of 19th century Orientalist painting, in the sense of the framework within which this meaning is understood. And I'm using the term economy of images in the sense that Baudron has developed it in his 2013 work on 4 levels of organization in the semiotic analysis of images. And this shift is far from subtle. It's not been the result of critical rethinkings of Said, quite the contrary. Paintings that were discussed as masterpieces of high art now serve an unblock function altogether as mere Islamic cultural heritage. Perhaps this explains how Osman Hamdi Bey is appreciated not as a Turkish national painter anymore. Like in the 1980s, he was still an Orientalist painter from Turkey who ought to be meticulously studied for his techniques and the biographical minutiae of his life. Now he's the par excellence Orientalist from Islam. This shift from the register of high art to the register of cultural heritage might also explain how Nasreddin Etienne could be exhibited last year as a token of intercultural communication, rather than a unique case among other exceptional cases who converted to Islam after his first few visits to Morocco and made it his home with his wife. Unfortunately, couldn't find any Wikimedia Commons license paintings to show his wonderful spectators rather than spectacles. Instead of like painting nude dancers, he also painted the Arab men who were watching them. So that was the maybe inspired by this impressionist subject matter of spectatorship, of depicting spectatorship. Now, James Clifford has famously shown, the anthropologist James Clifford, using the semiotic square originally developed by Remas and Cortés, how an art culture semiotic system constructs distinctions between tourist art, ethnographic objects, interesting technical or industrial innovations, or products of multiplicity on the one hand, and fine art, masterpieces, uniquely signed creations of some genius, products of authenticity on the other. The dominant values for his square, referring to the market of the early 20th century until after the mid-20th century, revolved around the polar concepts of authenticity and multiplicity, or inauthenticity. This system helps explain how Western institutions assign value and what criteria they use to classify objects as either cultural or artistic, as belonging to the register of culture or of art. Now, how would today's semiotic square look like in relation to Orientalist art? Possibly inverted within this one and modified. Now, in order to model this inversion, we shall try to think of the specific links between Neo-Orientalism built into the use of surveillance and communication technologies, like social media analysis, and today's resignification of Orientalist art. Orientalist art of the 19th century, especially the French variation since the beginning of Napoleon's campaigns, was indeed part of what Said has shown to be bodies of knowledge and techniques of representation in the service of the colonizing drive. This, of course, I don't think we need to really mention it, is a vast generalization, definitely does not take into account aesthetic and communicative aspects in the hands of talented creators that lend this painting its allure. This is why we like it. Well, I like it, at least. The saturated colors imposed upon neoclassical style, the exotic scenery combined with eroticism. So things that it offered the modern art in the 19th century. It offered to modern art. That was in brackets. On the one hand, 19th century salon paintings in the Orientalist genre by the beginning of the 20th century had become a sign of European tradition of high art in general, even though long after their heyday, which is roughly from the 1800s to the 1870s, their motifs were often copied after photographs and were a kind of mass communication, like mass medium in terms of their circulation. This part of their connotation, like connotation with erudite, traditional high culture of Europe, has been preserved, while completely different works qualified as art, as expensive high art in the 20th century, like the avant-gardes, for example. On the other hand, so on the one hand, this Orientalist genre. On the other, the stereotype of the Arab Muslim as exclusively victim or martyr and criminal, that was revived in the 1990s after the first Gulf War and was aggressively promoted after 9/11, became the template for the use of preemptive security operations, as we said before. Now, the potential enemies or possible humanitarian aid beneficiaries are not only in their own country, they are users of social media networks worldwide. They live in our cities and often become the target of counterinsurgency programs in Western cities through visual data collection and through the recognition of patterns of life. The corpus of Orientalist paintings, as part of genre painting, which is a type of painting that depicts people and places as representing something, a social class, a profession, a demographic, a race in this case, with certain adjustments to its more offensive versions of Orientalism, as we said, nude slavery, asserts the continuity of Middle Eastern presence with its colorfulness, luxury, sensuality in clothing and attitude, preserved ancient architecture, habits, and rituals in order for them to populate the new museums of art in the Middle East. This corpus, much like in surveillance Neo-Orientalism, also operates as a visual data collection, and it is also, as surveillance Neo-Orientalism is, a significant accumulation of patterns of life. It shows Orientals at home in their own countries. They are not immigrants, neither are they threatening. In 21st century multipolar, transitionally heterarchical systems, history has been weaponized to such an extent that cultural heritage is being revalorized, reevaluated, and older art-culture distinctions, in Clifford's very fundamental terms, need to be understood in their new conceptual balance, where authenticity refers to the political meanings of the subject matter, or formerly even second-class genre pictures. This is Baudron's mereological level, the first level of analysis, what happens in the picture, its style and recognizable content. If Orientalist art of the first half of the 19th century indeed played an important role as an institution of high culture in allegorizing social inequalities and providing narratives to disguise and legitimize colonial atrocities, this is Baudron's predicative structure, the second level, like what they want to do, what their function aims to be. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, Orientalist art was already a means of mass communication, even with its alternative, more humanizing and respectful, more exceptional, and even the critical versions. This corpus became part of a larger one of ethnographic knowledge. Here, there's a shift in register, Baudron's third level, the ontological horizon of these images, that responds to broader changes in the image economy, Baudron's final, deeper level. In order to understand this deeper level, we have to imagine how much, for example, invaluable prehistoric and ancient UNESCO world heritage has been destroyed since the first Iraqi war over the last 40 years, which means that there's a major shift in the economy of cultural heritage in general. Are things losing their value? Things are acquiring new values? The map of post-war international museum and cultural heritage standards is changing right now as we speak. Today, the same Orientalist production, with only a few adjustments, less emphasis on slavery, less nudity perhaps, recreates Orientalist art as primarily cultural heritage. The images assert the uninterrupted presence in the Eastern regions, anchors its people in some unchangeable patterns of life, not away from their homes, in some migratory quest, avoids the social realism of crime, decadence, or agony that any other type of modern art would immediately allude to. In other words, it fits in quite well with the pedagogy of stereotypes perpetually recreated by the new Orientalist analysts of social media and drone operators.
Great.
Thank you very much. I hope I haven't exceeded the time.
No, you've been just perfect, and I wanted to thank you very much for this speech, but now we are going to comment with the panelists that I thank you very much to join us today in this webinar. We are going to start with Professor Aspasia Papadima, which is professor at University of Technology in Cyprus. So the floor is yours for the first comment.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lia, very much for this rich and insightful talk you gave us. I really appreciated the way you connected neo-Orientalism to both new technologies and surveillance, and the renewed interest in 19th century Orientalist art. While you were talking, a lot of things came to my mind. When you spoke about neo-Orientalist surveillance through social media drones and algorithms, I wondered about its gender aspect. And then I started creating now, while you were speaking, some thought maps here in my notepad. And a lot of things came to my mind related to securitization and surveillance. And I remembered the feminist movements in Iran following the death of a woman who showed her hair, and all this movement that followed, or the female student who took her clothes off as an act of resistance. And she disappeared since then. And then I thought the relationship between this securitization and the role of the applied arts in this case, as it is my field, and how posters actually are exposing these kind of things. They are exposing neo-Orientalism, and somehow they destroy the romantic cultural image heritage, in my opinion. As designers usually respond almost in real time in social issues. And then I'm coming to this question. Do these systems represent or target women, especially Muslim women, in a different way? Are we seeing a continuation of older Orientalist images of female visibility and control, just in a new technological form?
Lia, would you like to answer already?
Maybe I will gather all the questions together.
You will gather all the questions, okay.
Yeah. I'll note them down and respond to all of them at once.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So I asked.
That's
very much
extremely important question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Professor Papadima. So we will go on with comments and questions with Professor Sotirios Batsetsis, which is professor at the Department of Culture and Creative Media, University of Thessaloniki, Greece. And sorry if I misspell your surname. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. That's not a problem. It's like the two words are actually interlinked. Like Thessaloniki is a city which is very close to Thessaly, but it's not the same area.
Yes,
So,
I know.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Professor Yoka, for this extremely insightful and novel, in my understanding, lay out of a very, let's say, seminal issue. I'm saying this as an art historian, as also someone who has briefly worked in 2011 in one of the Arab countries in Oman, actually curating a major exhibition there. So it's like one, I will not refer to that now,
Wow.
but perhaps it will come up in the discussion. There are many points I would like to refer to, but maybe I will just concentrate on one. It has to do also with Said. Clearly, and actually, your understanding of how, by pretending that the Said's critique is itself the dominant ideology, curators can claim to challenge actually Orientalism while actually neutralizing its political edge. I think that's extremely important. It feels to me it's like the same happens when, stock brokers at the Wall Street love to read Karl Marx, and when, psychoanalysis is used actually mainly to fortify our ego and less to challenge society. So that will be a kind of like early first kind of comment. However, I always read, me personally, Said, always in relation with an anthropologist that you all know, Michael Herzfeld. And I like Michael Herzfeld because he has written extensively on this notion of crypto colonialism,
Mm.
formulated first in reference to modern Greece. I'm talking about the Greece of the early 19th century. Just to remind you there, the main point is that uh, Greeks were compelled, the Greeks of the 19th century, to internalize the gaze of its former or symbolic colonizers. So they became actually, and this is, I think, Herzfeld talks about the most thoroughly Europeanized of Europe's others. So actually good pupils, to put it this way. And in this regard, he talks always about this kind of like double-faced Orientalism. So a self-Orientalization that did not aim to expose the mechanisms of Orientalism, but rather to adopt it as a mode of self-representation. I believe it will be very interesting to see if that can be applied to a kind of like museological emulation. So, in a way, if we can talk about a museological crypto-colonialism in reference to the museums that you have discussed, because these museums emulate the prestige models of European modernity, the universal model, the Universal Museum. This is actually a quote from Abu Dhabi Louvre, right? The encyclopedic collection, the Enlightenment narrative of the dialogue between civilizations. You've discussed that all very well. But at the same time, actually, let's say they have this appeal, and that's important, to the restoration of heritage. So let's say, Orientalism then becomes a kind of like symbolic capital. It will be very interesting to discuss that, and not only symbolic, also economic capital, right? In the Louvre, that I call it like the Louvre taking a vacation. I'm talking about the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. There is a kind of like, let's say, humor behind that. So it will be perhaps very interesting to discuss that further. As I said, this kind of a second generation crypto-colonialism that operates not through Western guardianship, but through self-curated emulation. And of course, perhaps we can talk about creating a method, a curatorial method of Orientalism, a new state of Orientalism, or an Orientalism of a second order that has become a transferable museal technology generating heritage, mainly heritage. And I think that's also important. So also heritage then and now I'm trying to make the link to also the first part of your discussion, talking about the governmentality or the dispositif of the data surveillance within the broader framework of surveillance capitalism. And in a way, we can perhaps say that this governmentality is using both the museum, not necessarily the art museum, even if we talk about museums of art, but the stress, the focus is on cultural heritage museum, as well as the algorithmic data management of surveillance capitalism. Both systems, one cultural and the other political, work to stabilize identity within this, let's say, crypto colonialism of second order. That's my first thought on that. Thank you.
I totally agree.
Then we will hear more from you on this. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then let's pass to Professor Shirley Milner, which will bring her views as an artist, as an activist, and a professor at City University of New York. So the floor is yours. We cannot hear you now.
Sorry, my video has been somewhat unstable, so I've lost a few things that have been said. But thank you, Lia, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to join. I find this paper really interesting, and yes, I agree with the previous remarks, but I think that you touch on so much that can be expanded, particularly, again, this notion of self, the kind of adopting this paradigm, this self-orientalization, which I think that you mentioned, and it's there, but I agree, can be developed quite a bit. And again, I think I agree that it goes along with this museumification and global capital. I mean, the building of these museums in the Middle East have been critical. And I really like the comparison between the kind of modernist structures, incredibly, self-aggrandizing, actually, modernist structures, and then what the paintings that are inside it. And again, I think that comparison can go a long way. Also with this both self-orientalizing, but also self-modernizing, if you can say, at the same time. And of course, it goes so much. I mean, the idea of naming something Louvre in the Middle East, again, completely connects to the kind of Western Orientalism that it comes from, but also this idea of legitimation in terms of, again, art, culture, high art, and bringing these works back into another kind of legitimation of the Middle East, that somehow it is cultural heritage. It, describes something about the self in the Middle East that is, again, also of great value. And it also comes to monetary value. The other thing it seems to me that you can talk a bit about is this notion of labor. Again, it comes up in relationship to the image of, again, the terrorist who's the Muslim. Again, re-othering kind of a group while attaching to the values, again, of the more cultured, quote unquote, Middle Eastern, and then having to rename the other as the terrorist, as the, the undesirable, and labor, because of course in those museums, I mean, when those museums were being built, the Guggenheim and the Abu Dhabi, there was, of course, a huge, I mean, they were again importing South Asian laborers who were kept in camps and had no rights and were badly paid. And so this idea of the other, both the South Asian and the Muslim, the terrorist, the undesirable, the people that can be sent back or othered in this way, I think remains important, attaching to a different kind of other than the conventional Orientalist other that Said, makes reference to, obviously. So I think that is important. And then also the artists' pushback, particularly during the building of those museums, in terms of, so many artists organizing to try to advocate for the workers. And of course, the museums coming up with this idea, which of course didn't work, buying those artists' work in order to shut them up. And of course, that didn't work. The artists were not interested in that. But again, the continuing critique, both in relationship, I think, to women, how women are, again, positioned, though I really think that it's really interesting to me, the women artists that you bring up in the piece, which I am not familiar with. And, that their relationship and their ability to go into the harems and to generate images that are closer to what women might really be feeling. But again, both in terms of women and in terms of labor, I think, and this new idea or really reorientation of the other. And again, the refugee, the people that they don't want there and would like to see leave. And the contribution to a certain refugee crisis, but idea of who is undesirable, I think is important. But I quite, I think that you're absolutely right in this whole notion of, of Orientalism now being reconfigured and adopted. And again, also because of the price, money, what the art market, though I wonder what happens now that the art market is kind of in a dip, and we'll see where it goes. But again, the global capitalism and the ways in which both artists and products of the 19th century, are being, reintroduced in different ways into the art market and legitimized and seen as valuable, and how much that contributes to the ideology around neo-Orientalism. But yeah, I mean, I had a lot of other thoughts. I thought really you bring up so many things, I think, that are really important. So thank you.
Thank you very much also from my side, which I'm going to put the hat of the commentator now, not the moderator anymore. So I'm going to call you Lia now, and I think I'm going away from this webinar knowing something new. So that's already something nowadays. The two neo-Orientalist currents and the way they link for me are very valuable in understanding how the world works actually nowadays. So something also practical, something useful. Many things came to my mind while you were speaking. One, I think it's worth to spend in 1 minute. Let's see if I can do that. Is this image, which, let's see here. Yeah, that's Altan, which is it's way more than only a cartoon artist, which was on the main popular progressive newspaper in Italy, La Repubblica, L'Espresso, and so on and so forth. It says, without the East, you will be the West of no one, right? So that's something that at a certain point you also say East, whatever the East is. And this is, I think, is something very semiotics and very interesting for us because, East and West is a category which works, Professor Paolucci from University of Bologna would say, in a participatory way, right? So where the first term participate to the concept of the second and the other way around, So that's very, very interesting for us. This also means that the two terms are not empty, but for sure they are interpreted depending on the cultural context, of course. During the Grand Tour time, Italy could have been seen the east of, the Northern European scholar and writers and artists that are coming here. And if you look at the several views, the paesaggio, of Roman ruins, Firenze ruins and Florence ruins and so on and so forth. It can be also this. So that's my first thought as a pure comment. The second comment resonates with also my research on the meaning of the built environment, and I think that this research can really develop further on how the cultural meaning and power are spatially organized and visually mediating in what you are saying. So we can look at the symbolic geographies, the spatial and discursive landscape between the East and the West, for sure. We should include the digital, of course, because nowadays, as you did, it's incredibly. I mean, there is a fuzzy, line between physical and digital, as we know. And as I said, there's also a pragmatic aspect on this paper and in general on what you do that I really like, which we can somehow with this theoretical and methodological framework find a way to unveil Neo-Orientalism as a sort of visual or spatial politics of representation where sign, images, practices, text, technologies, architecture, built environment, and so on and so forth shape a social semiotic of difference. So that's the second comment that I would like to bring. But my question is, in order to to go into this pragmatic aspect, and I would like to fully understand the evolution of Neo-Orientalism that you are presenting as. And I know that you introduced these two Neo-Orientalist currents, but in the very end of your talks, it seems that there are somehow four. The first one is, let's say, the surveillance Neo-Orientalism, that's politics, technological, the digital monitoring embedded with the stereotypes and so on and so forth, and that's very clear. The second very clear is the revival, let's say, of the 19th century Orientalist art and the rebranding that for you it's problematic, and I totally agree, on the this reframing, rebranding of Neo-Orientalism, painting a symbol of cultural dialogue versus the colonial domination, let's say. But then there is a third way, which does not really challenge or does not undo the ideological framework of Orientalism, but still, which is the non-colonialist portrayals of artists. Sorry, probably don't remember well. I was writing fast, like Diné or Browning. So this is like sort of alternative Orientalism. It can be the third, and then you have somehow the fourth, which is the new economy, right? The cultural heritization, if we can say that, right? So from Orientalism art to the cultural heritage with all that belongs, right? So all the securization, all the stability, all the discourse of authenticity, all the creation of certain historical narratives through the listing, let's say, of the cultural heritage, portrays, images, text, practices, and so on and so forth. That are maybe somehow coming from the past, but really, speak to the present in perspective to the future. Stop coming to the question, sorry. So the idea is it the first and the fourth somehow, what perpetuates the Orientalist logic today? So it is the surveillance Neo-Orientalism and the new cultural heritage economy, which in your opinion perpetuates these stereotypes? And is it this that as semiotician and as a researcher can somehow find a way, at least a theoretical methodological framework, to unveil them, if that's the correct verb in English? So thank you very much.
Wow, thanks to all four of you for taking the time to read or listen to the paper and think about it so profoundly. Amazing comments and questions. Thanks very much. I'm very grateful. I will try to respond in a synopsis. Now, first of all, about inverse Orientalism, like self-orientalizing and the subjects becoming, the objects becoming the subjects of Orientalism, of themselves. Said has talked about that already. That is an integral part of what he said. He even called it inverse Orientalism, and already in his book Orientalism, not in cultural imperialism, not in his comments on Orientalism, but already in the beginning, the last chapter was actually dedicated to this phenomenon in Middle Eastern countries where the elites have to depend on Western conventions, Western ways of thinking. What is interesting to me, not from a semiotic point of view, but like drawing from semiotic bibliography, is how we can indeed, and I'm going to Sotiris now, how we can indeed see that there is a very simple linguistic, psychoanalytical, and social interaction going on, whereby, I mean, Sonesson has showed this very well in how he used Todorov and Benveniste in his famous communicational model that altered alias and self. So what's going on is that there's a self and there's another, but there's always a point of reference that's elsewhere, an external point of reference. So there's always a tripartite communicational transaction. And psychoanalytically, we can see this in how Freud described the mirror stage. There's always somebody actually confirming that the child is looking into the mirror and is seeing itself. And socially speaking, or rather culturally speaking, the Oriental always refers to the West, but also the Westerner refers to something that doesn't exist, like the superiority of their own culture, right? So this is more interesting to me, like from the point of view of cultural semiotics, to see that indeed there is this exchange going on where we can not only speak of East-West, no, but of East, of a West, creating an imaginary East in reference to some external point of a geography and a culture that don't really exist. Now, the second point, I will answer in semiotic terms so that it's quite clear what I am referring to, how I'm using the actual terms. Yeah. I think what's important in the move towards how did you call it, Federico? Heritageization. Anyway, from art to culture, is that they're all part of this new pedagogy of war, where history is becoming extremely important. Like Israel has used its 3,000-year or 4,000-year history and its references to the Torah and to sacred texts. The Muslims also do that all the time. In smaller local nationalisms, this is also happening the whole time. We like instrumentalize, I think the more fashionable term now is weaponize. We instrumentalize history so much in order to forward much more specific, particular social agendas. Agendas that shouldn't be explained historically, by instrumentalizing history or by referring in a completely, free range way to whatever historical period suits our goal. So, yeah, to respond to Sherry and how this is happening now, I think it's really interesting that, as you said, the art market is in a dip. It's also happening with the heritage, let's say, market, with the values of global cultural heritage that are indeed plummeting because there's been so much destruction and so much death creeping into the centers of the so-called Western world, that it is very easy for these registers to change the whole time. One example is when Berlusconi, I think Federico will know this, returned an ancient statuette from to Gaddafi. He had already, a year before, transferred it from the Archaeological Museum of Rome to a smaller local museum so that it would lose its visibility and less people would be able to find it and talk about it. Then he gave it to Gaddafi. Then Gaddafi was the enemy of the West. And after the war, the statuette probably ended up in some private collection. Nobody knows where it is. I think this is another example is how in the Acropolis in Greece, there are these discussions, but we can't do anything about it, about whether we should rent out the space for fashion shows. Okay, it's devalorization of heritage, which is on a par with devalorization of art. But the fact that the registers shift from artistic to cultural is a result of this instrumentalization of history. So heritage acquires not a value as masterpiece, aesthetics, discursive product, things associated with the art category. Although art is a market, it's always the most expensive, the most interesting commodity in this market, right? The commodity of ideas. But even that now is being devalued. And a third point about women. I'm referring to Aspasia Papadima's really interesting question. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how hypocritical all these new museums in the Arab world are. Just like the discussions about Muslims and Arabs and the difference were in the 90s here in Europe about the veil and stuff. Because, cultures that are heavily patriarchal, on the one hand, might host carefully curated Oriental exhibitions, and on the other hand, are working within this system of a culture that is completely soaked in the degradation of women. Not only the visual one, but the degradation of women, of children, of poor men. The kind of pornography that is omnipresent in social media. It's available everywhere. So the fact that, for example, they don't allow nudes, or that Damien Hirst can build a series of sculptures outside the Doha clinic, but it's only of naked embryos because they're not allowed to have naked women, which is horrible. Naked embryos in very inflated size. I just find it really interesting because it's so hypocritical, and I'm sure that people in the Middle East, women in the Middle East who look at these phenomena every day, they're very aware of this as an actual hypocrisy. And I think the movements you mentioned are a very good example of that. On the one hand, there's extreme oppression, and on the other hand, they know they're operating within a system that depends on pornography, in the sense that it depends on the commercialization and the commodification of bodies and of sexuality. So I'll keep it on that very abstract level. Maybe a last point. My intention really, but you were much better than I mean, your comments were so much better than what I was trying to do, of a much higher level. It was just combine three ways of like semiotically approaching neo-Orientalism. On the one hand, Sonesson's communication model, that's somehow inscribed in my understanding of Orientalism and neo-Orientalism as self-other and something else, the point of reference. Baudron's levels of analysis that lead to an economy, and my only addition to this would be that there is a very direct link between financial economy and the discursive economy. They both produce value, and if you analyze value, you see that there's a core to it, and it's really a political movement that's financial and political and cultural at the same time. And third, Clifford's anthropological square. And I'm trying to somehow combine these three ways of understanding these new trends in order to understand basically this new era that we are entering, where this pedagogy of racism, nationalism, war of a new type is using all cultural assets in a novel way. This is what's interesting for me. I don't know, did I leave something out? Is there something else? I think these are, I've exhausted the notes here.
I would say that if there are any other question or comment from the panel, please feel free to speak up. But I would like to say that you didn't leave anything. So thank you for your answer, and thank you for leaving us with something, some new learnings. So that's what is the main thing of smart semiotics too, right? So let's then go to the conclusion. We thanks for sure smart semiotics to provide this not only digital platform dedicated to semiotics and to also interdisciplinary research. And we thank, of course, Professor Shelley Miller, Sotirios Batsetsis, and Aspasia Papadima for all the comments and the question. And last but not least, of course, we thank you, Professor Lia Yoka, for your talk. And actually, very last, but not very least, all the people that join us today in this webinar and that we'll see in the future, because this will be recorded in YouTube and stay there forever. So thank you very much to all. Bye.
Thank you, Federica, for the moderation. Thank you, Paul, for inviting me. And thank you all for the amazing comments. Yeah, it's a great honor for me.
Honor is ours. Thank you very much.
Bye.